Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and books. And today I want to talk about evaluations of writing and world building. And the reason this comes up, I was watching Star Trek Discovery Season 5. As people who have seen some of my very early videos might know, I am not the world's biggest fan of Star Trek Discovery. Um, that being said, there are actually some really interesting points that come up with some of the issues that I have with Discovery, but also a lot of the advice writers are given about world building and the philosophy to that. And it also applies to us as readers, how we evaluate things. And the reason I want to bring this up is Discovery Discovery does things sometimes that basically annoy me. And right. So let's talk about world building. I think for a lot of us, we have in our mind the general concept of world building, that the goal of the world building is to create an authentic, verisimilitudinous, existing, real feeling reality for the story world. That the story world must be consistent and coherent and cohesive. And as a general principle, there's nothing wrong with that. But we also know that it is a general principle. It is not a concrete rule, because there are lots of narratives that the world building is inconsistent, it is not cohesive, it is not coherent, it can be chaotic. And actually, that is fine, because the underlying principle of a lot of what we call world building is that it is in service of the narrative. And when we say that, we are not reducing the term narrative to plot. We're not reducing the term narrative to story. We're not reducing the narrative to setting. Narrative is all of those things. And world building, particularly for a lot of fantastical, be it science fiction, fantasy, horror, a lot of those things, world building is an aspect of narrative. And narrative is made up of all of these different constituent elements. So why am I making a big deal about this? If you take something like Harry Potter, particularly the first three books, what we would call the world building, the creation of the magical world that sits alongside, parallel to the Muggle reality, is inconsistent. It is whimsical. It is absurd. It is not coherent. It is not cohesive, and quite often is contradictory. Is that an aspect of bad writing? Well, no, it's not bad, because in that instance, the effect being generated is a fantastical reality for a children's book. It's not meant to be a cohesive, coherent secondary reality. The type of world building that Rowling was engaged in for the first three books was whimsical on purpose, because it was for entertaining children. Like, there's no getting around that. All of the attempts after the fact to retcon and create a more cohesive, all of those things are post hoc attempts to change the initial intent behind what was being done in those books. Because for that story, creating the sense of wonder and silliness and humor and fascination, that was the goal of it, not to create an authentic secondary world that could have existed. It wasn't to create an authentic reality. It was a fun setting, and it didn't have to make sense. We see a similar sort of thing with when people create dream worlds or fairy realms or any of these sorts of strange realities, they aren't meant to be real. They are trying to do a different thing. And therefore, the concept or the philosophy of applying consistency and coherency and making it definitive and concrete is somewhat antithetical sometimes to the type of narrative. And therefore, just because something is not cohesive, is not coherent, is not concrete, is not necessarily bad writing. And the two frequently get conflated because quite often we take what we want, what we prefer, what we have engaged with, the style of narrative that we consume a lot of, and we extrapolate from there that what works there must be the rule for everything else. And clearly that isn't true. Like it just isn't. When we think about metaphysical realities, or even in magic realism, the fact that there are these strange elements that appear contradictory, but they fit with the style of narrative that is being created. It's not to create a believable, standard, concrete reality. It's an effect that is supporting what the narrative is doing. The world building is in service of the narrative, just not in the way that secondary world fantasy typically does things, or a lot of science fiction typically does things. Morality plays, thought experiments, allegories, fables, all of these things. We don't have an expectation that those things must do world building in that way. We can have a preference for the style of world building that we enjoy, particularly in certain types of stories. But the idea that this is a concrete rule, that this is how it must be done, and if you don't do this, it is bad, that is where there's a short circuit in our reasoning. One of my favorite go-to examples, Animal Farm by George Orwell. Halfway through, the talking animals and like all of the neighbors aren't reacting to the talking animals the way that you would expect humans to react to talking animals. But halfway through, the pigs start walking around on two legs. Physiologically impossible. That's not the point. That's not an aspect of bad writing. It's an animal fable. That aspect of a verisimilitudinous concrete reality is not what Orwell is trying to create. And to judge Orwell's writing on that, to apply that as a criteria, that seems slightly misguided because it's not what the story, what the narrative is trying to do. It's not what the narrative is focused on. But the reason this gets us into a bit of a pickle is, can we apply that rationale to something that on the surface appears to be trying to create a consistent, coherent, concrete story world? And that brings us to Star Trek Discovery. I had issues with Discovery, but I started watching season 5. I've watched the first couple of episodes. And Discovery does something that I find genuinely frustrating. It has all of the appearances of a science fiction show that wants to create a concrete, cohesive, authentic story world to give us a sense of that verisimilitudinous reality. And yet, consistently, it breaks the rules that it sets up. It ignores the aspects of the story world that it itself has set up, quite often in the same scene or in the same sequence or within seconds of each other. And that's what I find frustrating. If we compare that to Lower Decks aimed at an adult, a teen and adult audience, because it is animation, because it is comedy, it can be far more absurd and contradictory and silly, and it can get away with a lot more than Discovery can, because Discovery is live action. It is asking us to buy into a believable, authentic reality, whereas Lower Decks leans into the fact that no, it's a cartoon. Even the crossover episode they did with Strange New Worlds made reference to it. It is meant to exist within that reality. And yet, because of the medium and because of the genre being comedy, it does certain things differently. It can get away with things that we may not allow a more serious live action show to get away with. We look at the problems that people had with Strange New Worlds with the musical episode. And like on the face of it, the musical episode was hilarious. And yet I know the suspension of disbelief was difficult for that because it seems absolutely absurd. Whereas if you had placed that musical episode storyline, if that was in Lower Decks, oh, we'd have all been absolutely fine with it. And yet, because it was in live action and because it was in a series that is typically, generally, each season is generally serious, the suspension of disbelief was harder. And yet, it's fantastic. It's a brilliant episode. You should watch it. But to go back to Discovery, if I was being ungenerous, I would suggest that Discovery is trying to have its cake and eat it too. Because it seems to want to lean into the believability and authenticity created by the Star Trek universe and the Star Trek franchise and the lore and the canon and the history and the idea that it's serious science fiction show dealing with serious topics. And at the other time, quite often within the same scene, it's like, no, but like we need the plot to do this, so we're just going to do this. And one of those aspects hit me in the face in episode 1 of season 5. A synthetic has been killed. A synthetic being, so a kind of android, an artificial human with sentience, an artificial being with sentience, but they are a mechanical computer. And we have one of the characters say, because they need information that's in its hard drive, essentially, in its brain, beam it up to the ship, but also go and inform its family or his family that he's been killed. You can't have it both ways. You can't pretend that you are treating this person with respect and as a sentient human being or a sentient being, and you're going to communicate with their family and be sympathetic and also steal their body for parts. At best, it is virtue signaling. Oh, we're going to say the right things, but we're going to do whatever we want. So at best, that line of dialogue was virtue signaling. At worst, it reveals sociopathy on the part of the character. Because, oh, well, of course we would say that to the family. That's the thing that's expected, but, it's convenient for me to take the body, so I'm just going to do that. That's sociopathy. And that's one of my problems with Discovery. This has happened repeatedly since season 1. The needs of the plot override what is a reasonable thing or within the range of possibilities for the character to say or do. The needs of the plot override it. And in most modern writing, when plot overrides character psychology and the concept of the world, that is bad writing. In most modern narratives, not all, because we have things like morality plays. And of course, a lot of Discovery and a lot of Star Trek in general is based around the concept of a morality play. But I think the majority of people would praise the morality plays that fit within the story world and are compatible with the diegesis. They would praise those as good writing whereas ones in which the moral of the story is overriding the established story world and diegesis, that we would criticize as bad writing because it's in contradiction to what the narrative is set up to do. Even though it is meant to be a morality play, it's in contradiction to the setting. But when it comes to discovery, that is something that happens frequently, where an aspect of story is incompatible with a lot of the progressive politics that Discovery is championing. That the needs of the plot are not necessarily progressive. They needed this body. And instead of trying to think of an ingenious way to both honor the dead and get the information, it was, no, we'll just say we'll honor the dead, but we're going to take the body and connect it up to a whole bunch of wires and do whatever we want to it. Because that was quicker and it was easier. But it wasn't convincing. But more problematically, I think, for Discovery is the fact that elements of the world are, in and of themselves, radically inconsistently portrayed. Now, science fiction shows in general do this a lot. There's a lot of hand-wavy stuff goes on in science fiction where something is introduced in an episode, like the ability to transport from one place on a planet to another place on a planet without going back to the ship. And when you introduce that, then in the next episode where that would be an easy solution, they sometimes go, oh, well, because of the neutron flux of the blah, 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 hand-wavy science fictional stuff to say why it doesn't work in this instance. That happens in science fiction all the time. It is an accepted aspect of a lot of science fictional storytelling. Do we wish it happened less? Yeah, in general, yeah. But as part of our willing suspension of disbelief, we go along with a lot of the hand-wavy, yada, yada. That's why it's not going to work in this instance. But at the same time, we expect the writers to at least make a bit of an effort. In the same episode, 3 of the crew are on these sort of speeder bikes, that floating motorbikes that look like basically they saw Star Wars and went, we wanted those. And they're riding through the desert, chasing 2 people who are also on bikes. All 3 of the people doing the chasing have personal teleportation devices, personal transporters. They can move instantaneously from where they are to almost anywhere on the planet or into space. They don't use them. Oh, well, maybe they didn't know where they were going. Then you have a line of dialogue saying that's where their ship is, basically. We've detected their ship. Then teleport there. You have a personal transporter, just transport there. You can be waiting for them when they arrive. You can disable their bikes as they approach. Like, you can move faster than them because you can travel instantaneously. But they don't do that. Then there's a whole sequence. We're going to ignore the fact that there are 2 spaceships in orbit monitoring all of this, and they could have transported security teams down to the enemy ship. They could have put it in a tractor beam. They could have done any and all of these things. Ignore all that for a minute and just, we'll look at this sequence. It's going to show the action of these people. Suddenly there's a big avalanche, and it's like, oh, well, we have to get out of the way of the avalanche. I'm going to go and, why don't we teleport away? Oh, well, we can't just transport away. Why not? Reasons, hand-wavy reasons. These people are about to be crushed. Oh, I know, I'll drive over to them and you can transport them away. But this is where Discovery keeps losing me. It keeps throwing me out of the narrative because they introduce a thing like a personal transportation device. It is such a powerful way out of almost any dramatic tension. It solves so many different scenarios. It can rob, if you actually think about the ramifications of what that personal technology can do, it robs scenes of drama and tension, traditional scenes of drama and tension. And we see this particularly in I think, the 3rd episode, They're in a, basically, it looks like a quarry, and they need to distract aliens. So one of them uses their personal transporter and teleports and distracts them, and then teleports again and distracts them, and then teleports again, and then gets hit in the leg. And they get to it, say, well, just transport it. I can't. I'm too close to the rocks. You mean the rocks that you have just been transporting around in the previous sequence? So you go, okay, it's a yada yada hand wavy. At this one particular moment, the personal transporter is going to fail because of proximity to these rocks. Even though you're in an open quarry. Okay, so maybe there's a special mineral in these rocks and he was too close. We then go to another sequence, which is underground in the same area, in a cavern, surrounded by the rocks, and they transport in and out. That is inconsistent world building. That is incoherent world building. That is not your usual yada, yada, yada in this one special circumstance. That actually just smacks of this is unimportant. We don't care. Therefore, we will just do. But if you're making it a plot point, if you're drawing attention to it, then there's an expectation that it has to be done well, that it has to be thoughtful. Now, far be it from me to say that like all of the writing is bad. Not all the writing is bad, but Discovery is full of instances like this. We can't beam down to these ruins because there's an energy shield. The energy shield is powering these weapons. We set up an EMP. The energy shield is down. The energy shield has reactivated. We know this because new weapons have been activated. We'll just transport out. But the whole premise of the episode was you had to walk through the jungle because you couldn't transport through the energy shield. You've drawn attention to this, even though like you probably had a shuttle. You could have used a shuttle. Like, no shuttles. We're going to transport down, and we're going to transport down onto a cliff overlooking everything because it's a stunning shot. And then jump scene, cut to a new scene where they're just walking through the jungle on the same level because reasons. That's what frustrates me. So is it a fair criticism of Discovery? And I think in some respects, there are elements that are fair criticism. But Discovery is not, in general, trying to present this as a very authentic reality. It does this so consistently throughout, where the spoken message, the communicated thing, has precedence over the diegetic reality, the story world, where the needs of the plot are more important than the previous elements established. It has done this so consistently throughout that it seems that this is intentional. This is an aspect of the thing that I have a problem with. This is an aspect of the storytelling that the storytellers, the writers, the showrunners are not focused on and don't want to focus on. It's not part of their intent. So if it's okay for Orwell to create an animal farm, something that is ridiculous in the idea that not only you have talking animals, but they just walk around upright and wear human clothes with no real problems, which, doesn't make any sense. And we can't really criticize that because that's not Orwell was doing. Do we not have to apply that same rationale to Discovery? Because this is and has been a consistent problem from the very beginning. From the very beginning of Discovery. Season 1, episode 1. Plot has overruled things that happened in the same scene, psychological realism, established rules, aspects of world building, All of those things have always been overruled by the necessity of what the story should be instead of an organic exploration of the story. If that's the case from the very beginning, then my assumption that this be an authentic, concrete, cohesive, and coherent story world is potentially flawed. No, it still bothers me. Bothers me slightly less when I think about it as, well, no, they're not trying to be consistent at all, and therefore expecting consistency from something that isn't trying to be consistent is futile and an unfair judgment. It still bugs me. I still think they could probably do both. But it makes me think that Star Trek Discovery, despite not being a comedy, has more in common with Lower Decks than it does with Strange New Worlds, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, um, The Next Generation. Discovery has more in common with Lower Decks, with its wacky absurdism and whimsy, than it does with the others, because it seems from the very beginning that this was not meant to be read that way. That is not a focus or drive or desire of the storytellers. So, can we still call it bad writing when this is not an aspect of the narrative? The narrative itself is trying to do something different. It is trying to be, at least in a lot of circumstances, a very obvious, very direct, very didactic, progressive science fiction show exploring family and found family and the need for inclusion and the need for acceptance in diversity. That it is focused so primarily on the message aspects that actually a lot of the other things are window dressings or way to explore stuff. And it's not trying to do it from the exploration. The exploration is a way to show those things. And it's an inverse of what I was expecting. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. When we talk about world building, when we talk about secondary world creation, we sometimes default to, well, this is how it is done, as if that is how it is done in all types of narrative. And sometimes we mislabel the narrative. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to like it. Like these things about discovery will always bug me, particularly because there's so many of them that a very minor tweak to dialogue or sequence can fix. But because it's been so consistent from the beginning, have I mischaracterized Discovery as a TV show? That it's not trying to do those things. It's not trying to be a concrete, cohesive, authentic secondary world. It's not trying to create a verisimilitudinous story world. That it's meant to evoke a sense of it. But ultimately, the major focus is on message. And if the major focus is on message, and I am correctly interpreting a lot of the messages that they are delivering by ignoring the other things that come up with interpreting it the other way. But if I'm correctly interpreting what they are telling me, then it is succeeding in its mission. If it is succeeding in its mission, then that is good writing. Do you see how this is a slight paradox with this stuff? And part of the issue is literature and art in general and narrative. There is such variety that trying to pigeonhole certain things into a specific box can be very, very difficult and can often send us down the wrong path because narrative is generally far more flexible and it's usually doing a bunch of different things. While it might primarily fit in one box, there are elements from all of these other boxes. And in fact, none of the boxes actually exist. It's all a giant spectrum. It's all a giant Venn diagram. It's all a giant fuzzy set. And so developing concrete rules for good writing always means taking into consideration type of narrative, intended audience, intention of the narrative, intended effect, what should be communicated, what the reader should or viewer should be picking up on. There are a whole lot of these other aspects to it. That it's not just about a particular style or approach that we assume must be the default for all others. But I'll finish up here basically by saying it's never going to make me like Star Trek Discovery. How it is inconsistent in its application of the technology that it created for the diegetic reality, how it doesn't consider the ramifications, how it changes whether or not those things are used. It doesn't consider very basic applications of the things and the ramifications of those technologies in very basic situations. It hasn't considered how any of these things actually would interact with actual people. Discovery is never going to fix those things. It's never going to be that type of show. But if that's been an issue from the very beginning, it never tried to be that kind of show. So I'm never going to like it as much as I like a lot of the other tracks. But maybe I dislike it a little tiny bit less. Thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate your support, and I will see you in the next one.